Is Gordon Ryan finished as an elite active competitor? Is John Danaher finished as an elite coach? Is Gordon taking over the coaching responsibilities at the top of New Wave? And do we now know all the teams that are going to be involved in CJI2? They're the questions that we're going to consider on this edition of the Jiu Jitsu Oracle with me, Ross, and my compadre, Callum. And we're recording this in the wake of a really interesting interview with John Danaher, and that's out on YouTube, I think conducted by Flow Grappling, where in the discussion, some interesting nuggets of information came to the fore. And the first one I want to talk about is the status of Gordon Ryan as a competitor. So, Callum, do you want to enlighten us a bit more as to what John said and what you think about the situation?
Yeah, he pretty much alluded to the fact that Gordon Ryan won't be competing again due to his illness. That's obviously not a concrete statement for the rest of time, but from what he said, it seems like that is what is happening in the near future anyway, that Gordon won't be competing again. Obviously, multiple athletes have came back from supposedly retiring or being put out of their sport in the past, so could happen again. But from what John was saying in that interview, doesn't seem like Gordon is going to be competing anytime soon, if ever again.
So, the quote I jotted down, and hopefully it's relatively close to what John said. I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but he said in response to I think it was whether Gordon would be involved in CGI2 and initially, and John was saying no, and then he said, "Well, Gordon's very sick just now, and I don't believe he'll be competing again." So, if you take that statement, I don't believe he'll be competing again as decisive, like he'll never compete again. And that's one way to look at it. Or maybe it was just I don't believe he'll be competing again, brackets, in the near future or whatever. But first thing is would you be surprised if Gordon didn't compete again?
Part of me yes, part of me no, just because he is very unwell at the moment, and I think if he gets that fixed, then he would definitely want to compete again, just because he's such a competitive guy. And even if it wasn't in jiu-jitsu, I know he's wanted to compete in MMA in the past, but I also know that he's seen several specialists about his gut. I think his gut's the main issue at the moment, and he's obviously got a decent bit of money behind him, and he's got some very good connections with that sort of industry, like Joe Rogan and stuff. I know has put him in contact with some good medical people, and they don't seem to have made much progress with it from what I'm aware. So um I think it just comes down to that, to be honest. If he is still unwell, then don't see it happening. If he does get it fixed somehow, which hopefully he does, then I think it is a very real possibility that he will return, even if it means that he won't have competed for a few years.
I think Gordon would be unlikely to compete unless he's 100%. And given the weight that he puts on his winning record, he won't be wanting to put that in jeopardy anymore. So I can't see it unless he's very well and he can do good training. I think he in the period between 2022 and the last ADCC, I think he set himself some goals that he wanted to achieve. I think that's why we saw the creation of a second super fight on that show. So that I think he now has more um, medals than anyone else at the ADCC, more golds. Is that correct? After that super fight win, I think he surpassed Marcelo with that.
Um, you mean past Andre Galvao?
Andre Galvao, yeah. Um,
More made up medals than Andre Galvao.
um, but we can double check that. But he's I think he's in the lead now, right? And I think he wanted. I think that's why that match took place. Um, against Felipe Pena, just so that Gordon would get like another chance at a gold medal. So I think like he's secured that. He might be happy with his legacy. But as we're on the discussion of like whether Gordon will compete again, what do you think his legacy in the sport is right now, if this is the end of him competing at the elite level?
That's a good question. I think he's the no-gi goat. I think that's fair to say. I think highest peak ever in no-gi, debatable highest peak ever in jiu-jitsu. Innovator. And then on the flip side of it, it's like, is it worth selling your soul to the devil at the end of the day? Like, for all that he's achieved, he's now suffering with these health conditions. So, like, on the negative aspect of it, I think that's definitely something for future generations to consider.
Okay, I think if it ends right now, the no-gi goat question is still open. I am willing to listen to arguments from people that back Marcelo and people that back Roger and people that back Gordon. I'm open to it all, but I don't think it's absolutely decisive. I don't think it's unequivocal that Gordon is the no-gi goat. Now, that said, also like the category of no-gi goat like didn't really exist until Gordon brought it into existence. Like we just had like who's the goat? Because these other grapplers have all put on the gi and grappled in that as well.
I think
So
it's a difficult comparison to make
yes,
because obviously it's a difficult comparison to make in like GOAT discussions in different generations in any sport anyway, but
yes,
particularly so because when you're comparing Gordon's no-gi achievements to Roger and Marcelo, it's pretty much just like ADCC versus ADCC because Gordon's got all these other no-gi achievements and super fights that weren't really around back in their day. So it makes it difficult to achieve, but just because of those things, that's why I would probably put Gordon ahead. I think, what do you think about the peak argument though?
I still think you could argue Roger. I think you could argue Marcelo. Um, Off the top of my head, like as for like someone having a peak and who they were beating at that peak time, I'd need to like consider strength of schedule, look at opponents, but you might be able to bring in guys like Rafa there, you know. So it is a good point. Like, was Gordon's peak higher than others? I think in terms,
Covenant as well could definitely be another one.
yeah. So I think in terms of like impact on the sport, for sure, right? Because the sport's growing with Gordon at like the helm of being the most recognizable superstar. I think the information within this sport, is it because Gordon was at the top at that digital age that we're in, or was it that Gordon's and John, his coach, have been like exceptional, the best at putting across that information? But like impact on the sport, yeah, development of the no-gi development under Gordon and John's been huge. In all areas, you know, from like leg locks, passing, defense, and really they were just kind of getting into takedowns more recently. So I think he's a very, very impactful grappler. I think like peak though, I look at who they faced at their peaks, and it's again, this is difficult when you compare eras, right? Because like you look at who Roger took on heavyweight wise at his peak, right? And you could look at someone like Janjay Ribeiro, right? But then a lot of people look at Janjay now based on like how Janjay did in the most recent ADCCs, etc., right? And you kind of have to measure Janjay as he was those years ago when he was taking on Roger, you know, because the game was different. But I do think like Roger had a deeper pool of top level heavyweights to compete against than Gordon has had. The other thing I looked at recently was like, of late, Gordon's most impressive victories haven't been like hugely decisive. he beat Pena on points. He beat Pena by verbal submission. Um, because of, well, we all know what happened in that 40-minute match that happened the day after Leandro Lo died. It was very close to Felipe. He beat Nicky Rod in EBI overtime. I think like the last time we saw kind of like top level Gordon was that ADCC run in 2022, when he submitted Nicky Rod. He beat Victor Hugo on points. But to me as well, there's still question marks that I would like answered before it was like definitive that Gordon was the GOAT. Like we've got that rematch against Kynan. They haven't faced since 2018. Kynan just double golded at ADCC. He would be due to have the super fight at the next ADCC against Gordon. I think we need to see that. I think we need to see Nicky Rod against Gordon again, based on their most recent match being a EBI overtime victory for Gordon. I think Nicky's was getting closer to him. And then him against Gordon against Felipe Pena, currently 2-2. Felipe has submitted Gordon, like physically. Gordon got a submission through like a verbal tap when Felipe had decided he'd had enough. Their most recent match was very, very close. Although I don't think Gordon was in peak physical condition, but like very, very close. And it's still 2-2. So I think like for Gordon to position himself as the definitive number one, and he's the one that says that, I would like to see a bit more evidence, and I'm open to listening to arguments in favor of other grapplers. I don't think it's like Jordan against LeBron, right? I think it's just stupid to like shut out the argument for the other guy who you're not picking, right? I just think like the debate is the debate, and you can be for LeBron and I can be for Jordan, but it's just like we have to have the debate, and there's no clear decisive winner in that field. Where in other sports, because if someone's racked up like the most amount of world titles by far, like they're undisputably the best. But yeah, just after that little ramble, what do you think about that status of Gordon as possibly the GOAT?
Yeah, I don't think it is completely definitive, but I think he would be the favorite to be put in the first position. Like I was saying earlier, the comparison is difficult because there wasn't as much nogi on the scene at the time of Marcelo and Hodger. But if we're saying who is the nogi GOAT, if I put it to you this way, if you try to imagine a world where Hodger and Marcelo had no gi achievements, they were just these guys that came into ADCC, did what they did in no gi, and then you compare that against Gordon, completely ignoring what they did in their gi careers, would you still have them comparable and debatable against Gordon?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, especially like Roger's unsurpassed all submission run to the title, and then Roger existing in a time when you had like Prime Galvao, Verdum, Janjay, and also like that ADCC run at times, the earlier ADCCs where you'd have guys, because you'd have these sort of outliers coming in, like like Jean Olav Ainemo, for example, back in the day, who was like a great grappler, but like I guess like it wasn't to the point at the ADCC now where it's like it is very jiu-jitsu-y, you know?
Yeah, it seems like there's potential in the next 10 years for it to go back to that with more wrestlers jumping over. And it would be good to see Gordon against like a potential Gable Steveson that's been training the sport for like 3 to 5 years,
Yeah.
or Pat Downey that's been training the sport for 3 to 5 years. So if it does go like that in the next 10 years, it would be cool to see him come back and face those guys. But that's just kind of completely unknown at this point.
And it's down to Gordon in part that like jiu-jitsu is so much more advanced than it was, you know? So like we have to take into consideration when we're thinking of ADCC like 15 years ago, for example, like the grappling as it was, like the jiu-jitsu wasn't as developed, so that wrestlers or MMA fighters with good wrestling background, etc., found it so difficult to make the transition over. Whereas now, like, you really need to be like highly skilled in this evolved jiu-jitsu game to play in the ADCC, for example. So yeah, I think you're right. And we are seeing more grapplers go over to more wrestlers start training jiu-jitsu and training jiu-jitsu earlier. So it's interesting. But yeah, I think it's like you have to I tend to like look at the era in the round, and it's like, well, who did Gordon absolutely dominate in his era? Like, who were his biggest career rivals? How good were they relative to the scene as it stands right now? You know? And then you look at that for Roger, and you look at that for Marcelo. And I just think it's like, if you guys are listening, watching, you want to leave comments on this, as to who you go for, please do. And if you want to throw any other names in, please do. But I just think it's in the round, particularly like those three guys, I think, are like where the discussion like generally lies. And if someone wants to throw in another name, that's fine. But I think within that, I would struggle to like absolutely rule out one or definitely plump for one. And I think overall for me it's Roger, gi, no gi, MMA, grappling wise, like that.
It's not the question, though.
It is not no, but then this is the interesting thing. It's like when you debate, it's like what is the question and what are the parameters of the question, etc. You know, and is it a valid question? But what your question again regarding Gordon was what?
So the no gi goats, you have to exclude everything they've done in gi, everything they've done in MMA. You're just looking at what these athletes have done and achieved in no gi and comparing that against each other. So Roger's MMA career, Verdum's MMA career, if you're putting him in there for all round gi, doesn't matter. We're just looking at no gi.
I think Marcelo's MMA career not being included actually helps him.
Yeah, that's fair.
So yeah, let us know what you think. I would love to do like a bit more of a deep dive into this, like looking through records and things like that. But I think we've got a few things to chat about. So we'll leave it at that for now for Gordon. I think like yeah, one of the best of his era, I will say. One of the most impactful grapplers of all time. Is he the greatest of all time? He's up there in the conversation. Is it definitive? Not for me. I don't think for you, essentially absolutely definitive either.
Not absolutely definitive, but I think he would be the clear lead in the argument for me anyway.
But you would have him in the lead, but you're willing to listen to other arguments. You think it's valid to have other arguments out there.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now, what about John? So, he's away to undergo a second hip replacement and I think a knee replacement as well. Which, like he said before, he would be undergoing some surgery that it was suggested would really limit his ability to be an elite coach, and he might have to focus on recreational grapplers. And then in this interview, he kind of said it had been suggested to him that if there's a knee replacement and a hip replacement on the same side, that's like, you know, a serious situation and maybe no jiu-jitsu. So I don't know if you'll be able to do recreational classes. I don't know if you'll be able to do no classes. It does sound like maybe he's going to struggle to coach elite level grapplers. And then, so like, let's take that first and then we'll chat about Gordon as a coach. So, what do you think about John maybe having to stop being the coach of elite grapplers? And then what do you think his legacy and standing in the sport is, if that is the case?
I think it's interesting because I've definitely seen John in the past, maybe when his hip's been bothering him, coaching without physically demonstrating. Like, he seems to have like a symbiotic relationship with some of his students where I think John Carlo's done it in the past, and maybe Placido as well, where he's just talking and they're just doing exactly what he wants them to do, whether he's had a discussion with them before the class or they kind of just know. So I feel like there would be ways around it if he couldn't physically demonstrate, and even if he wasn't the one demonstrating the techniques most of the time or running most of the sessions, I feel like he would surely have some involvement in their like professional grappling program, whether it wasn't like coaching each session, demonstrating each thing. So I completely understand what you say, not being able to demonstrate things physically after like 2 hip surgeries and 1 knee replacement, but I just think there would be ways around it, and he wouldn't have to physically demonstrate the things that he was wanting to teach and get across. That being said, if he was to take a step down from that, I think as far as the influences on the sport, like very similar to Gordon, even more so because he was the one that passed the information on to Gordon, and then Gordon's the one that kind of put it into practice in competition. But yeah, I mean, like probably the 2 biggest. Well, I feel like the guard passings came on a lot as well in the past decade, but I feel like leg locks and wrestling has probably been the 2 biggest innovations compared to 10 years prior. And the wrestling was not, well, the leg locks were not made up for the most part by him, but it was his like systematic approach to it, implementation, teaching it to his students performing it. And then obviously wrestling's been around for thousands of years, but it was his kind of implementation and like getting his students to really focus on it and then perform that in the competitions that has had a big influence. So I would say that as far as his legacy.
Yeah, definitely one of the most influential coaches of all time. Like I said, Gordon, one of the most impactful grapplers of all time. I think though with John, having Gordon as the person that displayed that jiu-jitsu to the world is hugely beneficial to his cause.
Yeah, I think it's like the argument is like, was Greg Popovich lucky to have Tim Duncan, or was Tim Duncan lucky to have Greg Popovich? There's obviously a bit of both, and there's some people that are sway more towards one side than the other. But yeah, definitely fortunate for each other to have them. And we've seen John have very successful students, but no one come close to Gordon. And I think with Gordon's drive, even if he didn't have John as a coach, he probably still would have done pretty well, even if it wasn't quite to the same level as he did achieve in his career.
Yeah, and you've got to consider John's role in coaching GSP and grappling as well. So it's not just limited to jiu-jitsu, but I just think within that like DDS team that existed, like the early iteration of it, like I don't think any of them outside of Gordon reached that truly like world-class level off the top of my head. Like Eddie Cummins, Gary Tonin, etc. Very, very good and like have had huge impacts on the sport, but they weren't at the top end of the ADCC, right? And am I missing anyone out there from like that early DDS kind of team?
You mean you can like throw Nicky Ryan in there, but he was quite young at the time. I think that time period for them, their whole thing was never being like, oh, we're like the best overall. I think their whole thing was, we're going to use this thing that people are underdeveloped in. And we've been training for 5 years and we've focused on this area being the leg locks. And we're going to use that to beat people that have been training 20 years because they've put like no training time into that. Whereas we've like hyper focused into that. And then as Danaher's kind of team progressed, then they rounded out, and now they're at the point where they've got very well-rounded, world-class athletes. But yeah, I think at the time, it's fair to say that none of them got to that level because like that's all that they kind of, not all they focused on, but that's what they hyper-focused in. That was kind of their whole shtick, and it worked for them up to an extent. Probably gave them more success than if they hadn't done that. But yeah, that definitely has its limits, just hyper-focusing on one area of the game.
Yeah, and then I think like another thing it could be said is maybe now, like it's an incredible finishing school. That Roca training environment that's
Yeah.
existed recently. So you get the likes of Giancarlo Bedoni, who was already a good grappler, but is now a great grappler. You had Merigali, who, well, actually, let's call him excellent, because I wouldn't say you had Merigali, who's already a great grappler, and now he's excellent at like gi and no gi as well, right? So, but you've seen the strides that people can make. But yeah, like it obviously it's not had that sort of pathway that exists in other academies like AOJ, where you can get, and I hear it on AOJ. Okay, like not all their juveniles, etc., are day one AOJ guys, right? And like some will transfer over at 14 and 15 and 16 and stuff like that. But I think like Guy would have a better track record of taking athletes from like what we'll say like colored belt level all the way through to like world champion level than John does. But as John operates in a different sphere, I know he doesn't like that's not really his academy's never really been set up to do that. But I get it if people are talking about like where does John stand in like great coaches of all time and stuff like that. I get the counter arguments of like, well, it's not like some coaches who are able to take um, juveniles all the way to world championship level. But that said, that's not really what he ever set out to do by the look of things, you know?
Yeah, I think as well, it's just like just the way things work, where when you're in his position, he's gonna have people falling at his lap. Like it's like the saying, the more you have, the more you get. It's like you're in that kind of position, you're going to get people flocking to you, and then that's going to make you look even better, have more success, which is going to give you even more people dropping at your door. And it just kind of goes hyperbolic once you get to a certain level and people see how well you're doing, they want to get involved, which just like kind of feeds into itself. So I think that's just part of it. It's not necessarily been his strategy to like go and take people and then just like add on that last 10-20%. But he is definitely very good at that.
Yep. So a couple other things from the interview. We heard more about New Wave's involvement in CJI2, and it seems that their team's pretty much set up, right? So we're going to have Big Dan at the biggest weight class. We're then going to have Luke Griffith under 99, which is interesting. We've spoke before about whether Luke would make that weight or stick it being heavier, but it does seem that he's come down a little bit.
Yeah, I heard for ADCC he was sitting around 250 pounds, and 100 kilos is 220 pounds, so that's quite a big cut. But he did say in an interview as well he'd been losing weight anyway just because he thought that was the best thing for him cardio wise. So maybe it's not going to be such a harsh transition if he's started doing it already.
Yeah, and then Giancarlo Badone, obviously like the kingpin at under 88 kilograms just now in the ADCC, so it absolutely makes sense to have him there. The lightest weight under 66, Dorian Olivares, who has made great progress since focusing a lot on jiu-jitsu. He's already got like a really good wrestling background from his younger days, and he's still a young grappler, but yeah, he's looked really good in ADCC in trials, so he'd be a great addition at 66 kilo. And then they've got an open slot at under 77, and they don't know whether they're going to do an internal trials or they could add a wild card there, or it could be both. They could ask some wild card people who might potentially want to jump into an internal trial there to get involved in that. But within New Wave, I think like a couple of names there could be at under 77 would be Oliver Taza, Isaac Michel, Jason Nolf. Yeah, did I hear his name mentioned by John?
Yeah,
So he's training there just now as well.
seems like it, yeah.
Yeah, that could be a problem for people at under 77.
Yeah.
What do you think about that team?
Yeah, it's good. I don't think they're going to use a wild card. I think it kind of goes against their image of like, we are the best team, we've got the best knowledge, we've got the best guys. I think we kind of go away from that for them to feel the need to select someone from a different team. But I think the team is very solid, very good, but like not anywhere near as unbeatable as probably people would have thought originally when you say like, oh, the new wave 5, because I think as much as people knew it was going to maybe not be a possibility of Gordon and Merigali to compete, when you just kind of say the New Wave team, you're probably just going to think of those guys in it, and you're going to think, wow, New Wave's going to have such a solid squad. And they do have a solid squad. It's just very beatable. Like Dorian lost first round at ADCC. Giancarlo, outside of ADCC, has been shown to be very beatable. They don't even have a solid guy put in at 77 yet. Luke Griffiths and Big Dan are both incredible, but they're both very inconsistent as well. So it's a very solid squad, but also highly, highly beatable, I think.
Yeah. Merigali, it was said by John, is facing a second shoulder surgery after the first one seemingly didn't quite go to plan how they'd hoped. So he's still out. Yeah, I think like if it was just picking 5 guys and weight didn't really come into it, I think New Wave would have a great 5. You know, if you had like the healthiest new wave team possible, and you just had to pick 5 guys. I mean, and you got Gordon and Meregali in that, then yeah, it'd be an absolute nightmare. But yeah, the way it's set up, I think you're right. I think they're beatable. And then John said that, and I don't know whether this was John just running through some potential other teams or whether these teams are definitely in, but he mentioned Atos and Gracie Baja. Now, as far as we know, New Wave are in, B Team are in, I think 10th Planet are in. Although I don't know, I haven't heard anything official as to 10th Planet being in, but I've just seen like graphics online speculating their team, etc. So like, and they're one of the big Nogi teams, so you'd assume they're in. We've got the 3 continental teams. We've got Europe, we've got the Americas, and we've got Australasia, and then that kind of left 2 slots.
Do we know if Pedigo was going to be in it? I thought that was a bit of a waste of a team, but I'm sure we saw that somewhere.
Yeah, well, like when we were chatting about that before, there was some speculation that Pedigo were possibly going to be in, I think. But again, and this is still speculation, there's 2 slots. Would it be Pedigo? I don't know. Would it be Atos? We think, like, we have Atos down as the favourites, like whether they're in or not at this stage, right?
Yeah, it depends the makeup of the Americas teams, but what we're going off of so far, the imagined Atos team I would have as the favourite if we don't know the Americas team yet.
What's your, like, off the top of your head, Atos team?
I'm not sure for 66. 77 and 88, I would put the Rotolos in there, and then under over 99, definitely Kainen, and then either Hulk or Andre Gavril if he wants to compete.
That's it. And you did pull out a 66er the last time we spoke about.
I had to do a little Google search, yeah, it wasn't on the top of my head.
No, I wonder. I can't quite remember who you picked, but yeah, we got there. Gracie Baja. It'd be interesting if they took part because you'd have Felipe Pena available for the highest weight class, and then you'd have Pedro Mourinho available. He's Gracie Baja as well. And then it gets like, I don't know. I don't think there's any like no-gi guys that absolutely jump out as to like, I definitely have them in for Gracie Baja. What about you?
Off the top of my head, yeah, no, it is difficult. We dominate a little bit more in the gi scene.
Yeah. And then, you know, if Felipe Pena's at the heavyweight, that rules out John Jones.
Yeah.
Because he trains at Gracie Baja, doesn't he? I think there's quite a few MMA guys trained at Gracie Bajas.
Sonnen, I think, is a Gracie Baja too.
Right. So if you can think of Gracie Baja contenders, please let us know in the comments. And if you agree with our Atos suggestion that they're the favourites,
Ricky Gillen.
let us know in the comments. That's a little Scottish grappling reference.
Jiu Jitsu lore.
Yeah, for some of our fans from our homeland. Now, anything else on CGI 2 or New Wave coming out of John's interview?
I don't think so. No, I think he was quite excited for the event. Thinks that it is looking like it's going to shape up pretty well, but as far as anything new, I don't think so.
Okay, I had one last thing. John said that there's going to be a variation on the quintet format.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know what that variation or those variations could be. But what do you think? Because I've always heard Craig kind of say it's a quintet style format. But what do you think they might be, or what would you like to see change from the quintet that we have seen in the past?
Maybe something to do with like the order, so that like I feel like sometimes when the teams match up in quintet, it's like, right, I really want to see him on this team versus him on this team, and then like one of those guys that you want to see, like one of the top guys, maybe gets stalled out by someone else, and then you don't get to see that big matchup. Something to do with that, like the order beforehand, maybe something to do with like smaller grapplers matching up with the bigger grapplers. There's quite a few things that could be. I'm sure it'll get released over time, but that would be my initial thoughts, maybe.
Okay, well, we'll see what comes out. No doubt Craig will be dripping out the info across the next few months as we build up to August's big event. Next big event, on the grappling scene is a who's number one at the end of the week that we're recording this on Friday. So we'll be back with a preview of that event. But for now, let us know what you think about whether Gordon's going to compete again, where he stands in the sport, whether John's going to coach at the elite level again, where he stands in the sport, and anything about the CGI2 event that we've chatted about. Get into the comments, like, subscribe, give us a follow, tell your friends.